The great Briton, Sir Winston Churchill, once described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. No wonder in a country that stretches from Kaliningrad in the west to the Kuril Islands in the east, spanning 11 time zones, and the train from Moscow to Vladivostok travels an entire week. It's hard to capture the vastness of Russia with a camera, but the best view might perhaps be the bird's eye view. From Europe's highest mountain in the Caucasus to Siberia's frozen Lake Baikal. Fur seals and whales in the Pacific to subtropical Sochi on the Black Sea. From the onion domes of the Golden Ring to Russia's Asian border in the Altai Mountains. From the antelopes in the Kalmykian steppes to the icebreakers in the Polar Sea. From the volcanoes and bears in wild Kamchatka to St. Petersburg, the Venice of the North. With a little help from this computer animation, we see at a glance how unevenly the Russian population is distributed. These light dots indicate where people live. Siberia and the far east of Russia seem almost deserted. They make up 3/4 of the country's territory, but only 15% of Russians live here. 85% live in European Russia. The lights of megacities Moscow and St. Petersburg shine into space. It is 6:30 in the morning and minus 20 degrees. The palaces on the frozen Neva may be illuminated, but St. Petersburg is still asleep. Except these young people. Every morning, the members of the Neva Ice People Walrus Club get together here, an ice swimming club. The young walruses can't be scared by the icy water of the Neva River. Does Russia appear more playful and European than here, at the foot of the citadel of Peter and Paul? Some Petersburgers complain that the winters are not what they used to be. But the winter fun of walking on the frozen canals of the city is still unbroken. Quite unthinkable in Venice, although St. Petersburg is so often praised as the Venice of the North. Icebreakers keep a narrow lane in the Neva open during the winter. This man with a chainsaw is his own icebreaker. Right in front of the Peter and Paul fortress, he cuts a swimming pool into the ice of the Nieva for a sporting event. Sunbathing in -20 degrees isn't for everyone. Swimming in icy waters, on the contrary, is surprisingly a national sport. Today, there's even a swimming competition in the Nieva. Water temperature, around 4 degrees. People have even come from abroad to swim a few laps. In the International Winter Swimming Association, they don't care about medals. It's about overcoming the fear of the cold. Although honours are handed out to the fastest swimmers. 3 kilometers down the Nieva, people are working. The Baltic shipyard is building 3 icebreakers at the same time. The world's first floating nuclear power plant can be spotted between the blue-red icebreakers. It will soon supply electricity to the mainland of the Arctic Ocean. The shipbuilders here in St. Petersburg have specialized in ice-capable ships. Russia has almost 40,000 kilometers of coastline, but the Polar Sea usually lies 6 months a year under a meter-thick layer of ice. That's why they build the ships here. Even 2,000 kilometers to the south, at the Volga Delta, the Caspian Sea freezes completely over in winter. But the autumn sun is still shining, and the whooper swans begin to arrive at the Volga Delta. They come from their breeding grounds on the Arctic coast. This pair of whooper swans has also flown 4,000 kilometers to reach the Volga, their winter paradise. In the Volga Delta, Russia's national river flows into the Caspian Sea, almost 200 kilometers wide. Two whooper swans encounter no shortage of other winter residents. Some 10 million birds migrate through the delta every year. Like all whooper swans, these two will stay together for the rest of their lives. This summer, they raised 3 young in northern Siberia and brought them here to the mouth of the Volga. In the next episode of Russia from Above, we will see how they are doing here. "800 kilometers west, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the peaks of the Caucasus are already covered with snow. Behind the grass-green folds of the foothills, the white colossus of Mount Elbrus lingers in the clouds. The mountain chains of the Caucasus makes the way to the highest mountain in Europe confusing. The double peak of this extinct volcano has an elevation of 5,600 meters above sea level. It's a pilgrimage site for mountain climbers. Starting from the mountain camp, over 15,000 people climb the Elbrus in small groups every year. The climb is not that steep, but the duration, the extreme elevation, and the thin air are more taxing than many climbers reckon with. 15 to 30 climbers pay annually with their lives for this exertion. Climbing routes often pass along dangerous fissures in the Elbrus's 22 glaciers. Even with mountain guides, Mount Elbrus remains a risk. We will see whether the groups make it today or whether they have to give up in this world of glaciers and eternal ice. When Christmas shopping on the Nevsky Prospect hits its peak, and when the snow swirls around the Kazan Cathedral, it appears as if winter has arrived at St. Peter's in Rome. This is when most St. Petersburgers say their city looks prettiest. Some 300 years ago, Peter the Great decided to build St. Petersburg. To construct the Peter and Paul fortress, he commissioned the Ticino architect Domenico Trezzini. Everything was required to look European. The typically Russian-styled Church of the Saviour of Blood could only be built 200 years later, after Europe was no longer that fashionable in Russia. Not all of St. Petersburg's fairy tale ensemble was built during Peter the Great's lifetime. The particularly beautiful Bolshoyachinsky Bridge over the Neva was not built until the beginning of the 20th century. By 1703, the marshes around the Neva were not as completely deserted as the founding legend has it. Peter the Great first expelled the Swedes from their primitive fortress of Nynchans. After that, he built only the Peter and Paul fortress. The vision of a complete, newly planned city built from scratch emerged only 3 years later with the Vasilkevsky Island. Today, the blueprint still bears witness to the strict planning. By 1714, the city already had 50,000 livable stone houses, but it was only after Peter's death that Tsarina Anna developed today's city. She moved the center from the Petrograd side of the Neva to the Admiralty side. In the 20th century, the city began to grow with blocks of flats on the outskirts. With up to 5 million inhabitants today, St. Petersburg is the 4th largest city in Europe, after London, Paris, and Moscow. Four hours express train south, Moscow looks almost like a video game. The Ostankino TV Tower is Europe's tallest building. The high-rise Hotel Ukrainia on the Moskva still recalls the late Stalin era. It's not not only at Christmas time that the Bolshoi Theatre and Red Square are staged with hundreds of lights. The spruced-up luxury department store GUM sponsors the huge ice rink right by the Kremlin walls. Disneyland would eat its heart out for such scenery. Just a few hundred meters away is also the President's Building. Red Square is naturally a kind of showroom for all Russia. However, permission for aerial filming is almost never granted here. Even though there are no secrets revealed here, except maybe for the striking symmetry of St. Basil Basilica's 9 onion domes. "5,000 years ago, people already lived where Moscow stands today. But in 1156, the Muscovites built the first wooden Kremlin walls, which marked the beginning of today's Russia. The Borovitsky Hill, on a narrow bend of the river, offered the ideal strategic location. From the 15th century, the Kremlin walls were built in their present form, with 20 defense towers and a total wall length of 2,200 meters. The purpose of a Kremlin, and not only in Moscow, has always been for the protection of sacred and administrative buildings, as well as the palaces of rulers. In 1812, Napoleon burnt down almost all of Moscow, but reconstruction began the following year. The merchant routes leading to the Kremlin almost form the shape of a star. Moscow grew in layers, from one ring to the next. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is surrounded by 4 rings. The small town of Rostov at Lake Nero, located on a side track of the Trans-Siberian Railway, still evokes an aura of elegant prosperity and the air of a golden age. The Golden Ring is now used as a label for the string of historical cities north and east of Moscow. The rich trading and artisan towns formed together with the ruling Moscow the cradle of Russia, nestled along the river Volga. From the 16th century, the Golden Ring cities financed the expansion of Russia into Siberia. At that time, furs and pelts were the first riches from this unknown hinterland. Ironically, the term the Golden Ring was coined in Soviet times to describe Rostov and the chain of historic towns around Moscow. In summer, tourists queue in this garden surrounded by onion-shaped domes. Quaint towns like Sergeyev Posad, Susdal or Rostov Veliki seem a bit dolled up, but they preserve the style of the old times, and every church seems to be surrounded by its Kremlin. These towns were tucked away in a thick primeval forest. The Mongols, who frequently plundered towns in Russia, didn't get this far. And when industrialization came later, many of these small cities were overlooked a second time. The Volga. Even the larger ships are dwarfed by its size. People say the Volga consists of masses of water, but of even more sky. Europe's largest river is 3,500 kilometers long. Today it is Russia's most important waterway for vessels navigating through canals and artificial lakes from the Baltic Sea to the Black and Caspian Seas. The prosperity produced by the river probably ignited the famous love of the Russians for the Volga. The Kremlin walls of today's industrial city, Nizhny Novgorod, speak of self-confidence. The wealth from the Volga has always aroused greed. Even monasteries along the Volga were built like fortresses. The Makarev monastery was burnt down by the Tatars in 1439, demolished by the Cossacks in 1670, destroyed by fire in 1816, and sunk by a spring tide in 1859. The Sviazhsk monastery was originally a fortress and later transformed. Today, the monastery and the cathedral are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Ever since the Volga was dammed, Sviazhsk has been located on an island, accessible along a dike. When the Volga passes Nizhny Novgorod, the dachas and the villas stretch along the river. The Russian version of an ultimate rural idyll. The further the Volga flows south, the more Russia mixes with the influences of the Orient. Kazan can be seen from far away. The Kul Sharif Mosque reveals that Kazan not only lies on the river Volga, but is also Russia's Muslim capital. The mosque was completed only in 2005, and its name symbolizes the spirit of independence among Tatars. In fact, Kul Sharif was the imam of Kazan in 1552, when the city was struggling against Ivan the Terrible, ultimately in vain. Mesmerizing Kazan was the first ever non-Russian city to be incorporated into the Tsarist Empire. The Peter and Paul Church was built when Peter the Great visited the city, clearly an admirer of Bavarian Baroque wall painting. A Lenin statue and Asian ambience. A European station and the new stadium. A 1,000 kilometers downstream lies a city which changed its name for a reason: Volgograd. This is the face of Motherland Calls. Construction workers have climbed up from inside this giant lady. Her concrete constantly needs to be kept in shape. Motherland Calls, as Russians call her, rises to the sky above Volgograd. Most people only know this million-strong city by its old, almost haunting name: Stalingrad. In 1942, Stalingrad was almost completely destroyed. The last of the ruins was left standing as a memorial. Otherwise, Volgograd doesn't know old buildings. Here, deep in the south of Russia, some 200,000 German soldiers died far from their homeland. along with almost 1.5 million Russians and people of other nationalities. Motherland Calls never experienced the horrors of war in Volgograd again, but her foundations are in need of some maintenance. No wonder, with its 8,000 tons of weight. The statue was formed of steel wire with shotcrete sprayed onto the framework. The architect is said to have modelled the body on a Russian discus thrower and the face on his own wife. Motherland Calls gazes up the Volga. For Russians, the mother of all rivers. To the left and right of the Volga's water mass, as you travel south from Volgograd, the more the landscape becomes a dry grassland. Only a few kilometers from the watery landscape of the delta, the steppes of Kalmykia begin. It hardly ever rains here, but the steppe is home to some very special locals, the Sagas. Sagas belong to the antelopes, and they need no one to give them a leg up. Like some African antelopes, the Sagas are critically endangered. Sagas are already extinct in the steppes of China and Mongolia. Man-made watering holes help the Sagas survive here. But as animals of the steppes, they can survive for days without water. Their curiously shaped nose has adapted to the environment. In winter, it preheats the freezing cold air. In summer, Saga noses combat the dust in the steppes with their moisture. But Kalmykia's steppes are not just dry, but also salty. Dried up lakes have left behind psychedelic patterns on the land. A long time ago, the Caspian Sea flooded the steppes of Kalmykia, leaving behind a salty ground. Sea minerals like bromide and chloride color the salt. More and more salt has collected on the surface and is becoming more concentrated in the few remaining bodies of water, such as the huge lake Manich-Gudilo, a paradise for water birds. But as the lake becomes saltier, fewer native freshwater fish can survive. And so the pelicans lose their food source. Wild horses inhabit the lake's largest island. park ranger only comes around with water if it gets all too hot in the summer. Otherwise, the horses live completely on their own. But from an ecological point of view, Manegd Gwydylo is above all a safe haven for migratory birds on their way from the Arctic to Persia and Africa, from geese and pelicans to cormorants. On the other side, at the western end of Russia, is Kaliningrad, which until 1945 was called Königsberg and was part of Germany. Nowhere are there any paths. It's just sand, more sand, and the heavens. You might think you were in the Sahara. That's how Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann described the most famous attraction of Kaliningrad, the Curonian Spit. It was created by eternal west winds, which brought all the sand here over the Baltic Sea after forests had been cleared on the spit of land 500 years before. That same eternal wind, however, will someday destroy the spit by blowing the sand away again. In an attempt to delay this, forests have been replanted. For almost 100 kilometers, the spit separates the Curonian Lagoon from the Baltic Sea. The larger side on the north of the spit is a part of Lithuania. Kaliningrad and the lagoon are now allowed to show their German history again. The Königsberg Cathedral was rebuilt in 1998, after standing for more than 50 years as a ruin. It is Immanuel Kant's church because the city's greatest son, the philosopher of the Enlightenment, is buried at the cathedral. The hotel on the other side of the river still goes by its old German name, Kaiserhof. It still serves the German speciality, Königsberger Klops. 2 rows of houses and the lighthouse of the old fishermen's neighborhood were rebuilt in 2012. In the neighborhoods of Amalienau and Maraunenhof, many of the old houses were used after the war and did not need much reconstruction work. The remains of the medieval fortress were left standing as well, most likely because in Soviet times it was considered too difficult to demolish it. The most appealing asset of Kaliningrad is the ice-free harbor on the Baltic Sea. The climate reveals Kaliningrad is almost twice as far from Moscow as from Berlin. Tourist boats putter about on St. Petersburg's river Fontanka. Nearly 100 rivers and canals crisscross the originally planned city. From 1703, countless serfs worked to create St. Petersburg from the swamps along the Neva. Even at that time, it was a question of accessing the Baltic Sea and its trade routes, and of the new Russian orientation to the west, to Europe. Peter the Great himself is buried in the fortress cathedral, as is Catherine the Great. We know today the Peter and Paul fortress was far more important to Tsar Peter than creating a city from scratch. Tsarina Catherine founded the art collection of today's Hermitage. It is the loveliest view of the lovely city on the river Neva. Much of what was long attributed to Tsar Peter the Great is in truth due to the love for the arts of his much later successor, Catherine. No place in St. Petersburg today attracts more visitors than Catherine's Art Palace museums around the Alexander Column. When these statues were placed on the cornices, it wasn't considered a problem their faces could only be seen from the palace's upper floors. Likewise, the dome of the Cathedral of Kazan, the onion towers of the Church of the Resurrection, and the Art Nouveau beauties with the globe on the roof of the Singer Sewing Machine Company all play with height. People on the ground were left only a steep view of art. This planned city was built 300 years later and 700 kilometers further south, Moscow City. Six of these skyscrapers tower more than 300 meters at this bend of the river Moskva. Even New York boasts only 2 more buildings of this height. A river bend further, the brightly lit Hotel Ukrainia is one of the old generation of high buildings that formed Moscow's skyline for over 50 years, when the hammer and sickle was still the future. The magnificent Lomonosov University presents all the structural ingredients of socialist classicism. From 1947 to 1953, Soviet party leader and dictator Joseph Stalin commissioned 7 skyscrapers in this style. Stalin's 7 sisters recently received a modern new sister. Architecture has a message and a story to tell whenever it follows an overarching plan. The hammer and sickle on the Foreign Ministry building, however, is probably due more to the protection of historical monuments, just like the timelessly beautiful Soviet star on the roof of the university. If you find the right angle, the towers of the old Kremlin, the Stalin sisters, and the new business city are united in one picture. The bird's eye view makes it possible. Muscovites today have other worries. The massive traffic jams are reminiscent of Los Angeles. The concrete neighborhoods are eating their way ever further into the periphery, as in all metropolises. Russians feel nostalgic about their onion domes, but they tend to live in modern high-rises. The well-off prefer to reside in the outlying districts. The dream of a little house with a yard is the same in Moscow as everywhere. Some 100 kilometers south of Moscow is Kolomna. It's one of the oldest cities in the greater Moscow area, and of course, it has its own Kremlin. Today, Kolomna is the center of Russian grain production. The soil here is extremely fertile. And when it's time for the summer harvest, then it looks like a ballet of harvesters. back to the south, where Russia stops in the middle of the Caucasus region. The glaciers of the Elbrus Massif attract thousands of mountain climbers every year. In small groups, they fight their way through the shortage of oxygen up to the 5,000 meters, where every horizon melts with the sky. These climbers have made it to the highest of the two peaks of the Elbrus. There are still many pictures to see of the Caucasus, and many secrets to tell. From the mysterious towers in Ingushetia, from the melting glaciers, the mountain goats, the highest village in Europe, the oldest town in Russia. This will be in the next episode of Russia from Above.